Good morning, Internet viewers around the world, and a special shout out to my favorite niece, Ray Ray. I hope everyone got some well-needed sleep and are recharged for the day, because we have been up all night. Just kidding. We've charged our coffee pots and we're ready to go.
For those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday, you can catch up on all of our content on the HAS2 website on the Contest Catch-Up page tab. We had a panel interview with some key thought leaders in space cybersecurity, game updates, and a keynote from Brigadier General John Olson, and a fascinating interview with the NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy.
If you don't know, the HAS2 CTF has ended, and we are calculating the scores as we speak. The last time you heard from us was 4 p.m. Pacific time yesterday, and as you can imagine, a lot has happened overnight. This game is a 24-hour attack-defend competition, so while you might have been sleeping, these 8 teams geographically dispersed around the world have been shooting code across cyberspace, trying to disable each other's satellites while keeping theirs healthy non-stop.
As is typically done at DEF CON CTF, we blacked out the scoreboard at 6 a.m. Pacific this morning, just a mere 4 hours before the competition ended. In fact, so much happened overnight that we are making a hot decision right now to let our CTF expert, Jordan Wines, and some of our game designers from Cromulence take the time they need to really dig into the details to explain how the competition unfolded.
Yes, and we also know that the teams are staring at a blacked out scoreboard and are anxiously awaiting results for the announcement of the first place $50,000 prize winner, second place $30,000 prize winner, and third place $20,000 prize winner. That means we are going to shift our schedule and run our panel later today after we announce the winners along with DEF CON founder Jeff Moss, aka Dark Tangent. So stick with us for a couple minutes as we make this shift so Jordan and the Cromulence team can take you through the highlights that happened all night long.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited to be joined by Jason Williams and Steve Wood, or is the teams might be more familiar with them, Surgoon and Deadwood, who've been the Cromulence Excellent Game Competition team. Welcome, gentlemen. Happy to have you.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yep, thanks, Jordan. Nice to be with you.
So I'm especially happy because there are things that I can't answer about the game, and I've kind of been, trying to help translate some of this stuff, but we've got the actual experts here. So there's been a lot that happened. There's been so much that happened overnight. I about lost my voice just staying here all night. Well, not quite all night. I got more sleep than these guys did. But let's go ahead and take a look at a kind of summary of what the scoreboard did overnight. We're going to start from the beginning of the game and go until the scoreboard went black at 6 a.m. this morning. So this scoreboard is kind of a new rendering that we haven't seen before. We're going to show up top when challenges were introduced, and then we can just see the team's kind of scores. So you'll see things like scoring positions are changing now because of the service level as that shifts and changes. And right about now is right where we were doing our last broadcast yesterday, right? And so we can see there was that first blood that we mentioned briefly. I'm going to go into more detail about a lot of these things. You can see battery alert. That's going to become real important. Again, several of these challenges going to get introduced, and then overnight kind of continue strong. Lots of big shifts. So we saw a lot of lead changes. The lead change didn't change a whole lot overnight. We did still have SolarWine manage to maintain a pretty good lead right up until that's the last we saw, right? So at 6 a.m. was the last time the scoreboard was public. It's got a good spread, but if you notice in the upper right, there's a Challenge 6 that was released that included some solves. That happened in between that game time where the scoreboard's not on, but things were kind of happening. So that's the game as we saw it from the score before things went dark. Now let's kind of step back and talk about some more of the details that happened throughout it. All right, so first let's go back, and if you remember, we kind of had a weird update at the 4 p.m. update. I came back on and said we had a scoring event from Dice Gang, which is an oddly phrased way of putting it. What it turned out was this was actually Team SolarWine. They were scoring for Team Dice Game, maybe accidentally, probably accidentally. I don't know, like Jason and Steve, have you guys ever tested an exploit as another team if you had access, or do you think it was just a complete mistake?
I think that they were attempting it just to see what would happen.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I actually have in the past thrown an exploit that gave another team points to devalue points for maybe a competitor. So there are sometimes strategic reasons for it, but I think you're right. I think they were just sort of testing and evaluating. And it was a small number of points because of, again, if you remember from yesterday's explanations, we've got these rounds, right? So the rounds are scored every 6 minutes, and you have scoring opportunities against all the teams and all the services every 6 minutes, depending on the service, right? Some of these were SLA based. And so it's to your benefit to do it as much as you can. So just a couple coming through from Dice Gang. So we kind of said it was some scoring thing that happened. They got some points. That was really SolarWine. And we would see that actually too if we come back here and scrub through this. We can see SolarWine's starting to pull away. There we go. You can see that slope just ticks up right here on the scoreboard. As that slope is ticking up, that's them starting to solve that challenge and get those points. And we're starting to get a little bit more diversity. Now, I did show a little bit about this challenge before, but let me step back and let's go to our whiteboard map of all the infrastructure. And the nice thing is we have the experts that helped build this here. So later on, we're going to talk about specifically what components are where, what's doing what, and how this thing this little diagram maps to the physical flat sat that the teams are working with. So remember, the teams were coming in over this VPN. They connected to their ground station, their Cosmos instance. There's two little things over here that we didn't show you yesterday because the teams weren't, we can't tell the teams about things before they're intended to be aware for everybody, and they had to kind of find that as part of it. But there was these other servers that were involved that weren't on that diagram before. But again, the teams were coming over this user segment server, and we told you this is sort of where the next challenge was. They knew that it was part of the challenge, but what it took for them to move across this radio link was essentially the challenge. So let's go ahead and actually look at the binary, and again, this is what the teams were doing. So the teams were analyzing this binary. They were told there's a binary on it, and actually, Jason, so this binary, I opened it up, it's like C++ and x86, right? But that's not, the challenges across the infrastructure are all different architectures, right? So this one happens to be kind of a little bit more like a desktop app because it was running on that ground station. What are some of the other architectures that were kind of spread throughout the system?
Yeah, so there was obviously x86 like Jordan mentioned, but we also had on the flat sat itself ARM processor on the ADCS, which is this top board here. And then we had a Spark V8 soft-core processor, which is a Leon 3 processor on the CNDH. And then we had also another ARM processor that was present on the ADCS as well, the Attitude Determination and Control System.
All right, cool. So I'm going to ask you some more questions about what each of those do and how they're kind of involved later. But just as a kind of high-level summary, if you've got a cell phone, it's probably running an ARM CPU, right? If you've got an Android or iPhone, you've got probably an ARM CPU in there. Maybe if you've got an M1 Apple Silicon new laptop, you might have ARM in your laptop. But for the longest time, that was always where x86, x64 kind of lived. And then Spark is just, that's like an old CPU that you don't hear about as much in kind of these modern day systems. But I think it's probably pretty typical that satellites are going to have lots of little components running all this different stuff. So we're starting though again at the ground station. So let's actually take a look at this binary. I'm making things difficult for Josh and the switching by keeping him on his toes. So pulling up this binary, if I just open this up, and now I can actually talk about the answer, right? So we can kind of spoil things a little bit for the teams. I see a bunch of text information. I see C++. And this is actually just kind of like argument parsing. So I can actually scroll through and you just see like command line flags. So if you're reverse engineering something, you see a bunch of like dash dash something. You know, that's like a thing you type in to do different operations on this binary when you run it. So if we're trying to find out like what this thing does, and the hint that we gave the teams was figure out what communication is happening, right? And so the last thing after all this kind of just string stuff and argument parsing stuff is this user segment packet. And now it's like, okay, right, this is the kind of thing. So like Jason and Steve, like a user segment packet, like what is that? Where does that go to? Do we need to go back to our diagram and like kind of like maybe you walk me through, what is it like a user segment packet? Where would that go?
So a user segment here is one of the mechanisms that teams can use to communicate over the radio frequency link and communicate with other flatsats. So this is actually their primary mechanism that they use, at least at this point in the game, to talk to and attack the other team's satellites.
Okay, so in there, yeah, so as again a reminder, the teams are coming in from the bottom here.
Yes.
This is the team infrastructure. They're going through their ground station, which they can talk to sort of like administratively, like the normal link to their flat sat. And we've got like 8 of them kind of all stacked up, right? So each team also has their own infrastructure down here. Although this user segment server, this was like one shared thing.
Shared service.
Right, and that's because it's got like one radio. It's actually communicating, and I guess this is kind of typical in satellites. You've got to like time slice or communicate like over like these shared radio links.
Yes.
So what kind of limitations though? I know that there was some rate limiting. What can you tell me about the rate limiting that happened here?
Yeah, so we have a limited bandwidth because we're going over RF. It was around 38 kilobits per second. So we instituted rate limiting on this.
That's like a modem speed, right? Like the
Yeah,
old,
I mean,
the old
it
days.
was pretty low, but it's not unusual for satellite links. And so we limited to 1 packet per second, and the packets had a maximum size associated with them. And this was just to prevent teams from kind of saturating that link and saturating our infrastructure.
That makes sense. And later on, that's going to be really important because some of these challenges, some teams were able to get more benefit out of that make more use out of that channel than others were. So for this one, though, again, the teams, this is them just still trying to figure out how to talk to the other satellites, right? They've got connections to their own, but they're trying now to figure out how to talk to the other ones. All right, so let's go back to the binary, and I'm just gonna really quickly kind of summarize through here. We've got this packet, and we're going to switch over. If there's some RSA signing here, right? So I see this and I think, okay, there's some encryption going on. I don't want to have to reverse all this, kind of on the fly. But if I see encryption, like my eyes glaze over. Thankfully, like I have other teammates. Usually, like in a CTF team, there's like well-rounded, right? You've got the crypto person, you've got different kind of experts in different domains, and we did see a number of teams were able to solve this. So you know there's something related to crypto, and if we go through here, we can see they're generating a crypto. I think where it gets interesting is, let's see, generate a key. I'm kind of going through all these different functions. This is the first thing that I thought, okay, that's kind of weird. I see this RSA multi-prime keygen, and I usually the way that encryption is going to work with RSA is you've got two really big primes. You multiply them together, and the secret are those 2 primes, and then the public key that is used to do the encryption is the result of that multiplication. And so it's a little weird to see this. So I already feel like spidey senses go off, right? One of the things you're looking for in a CTF is maybe there's some shenanigans kind of going on here. And so that's definitely where I would start to have some suspicions. And if we kind of dig into that, there's a lot more reversing that had to be done. But one of the key things is right here, there are going to be 3 different, instead of 2, which is typical, there's 3 different factors being used. One of them is much larger. And essentially the flaw here is that the teams had to figure out that much larger component, the prime that was bigger than the other two, is actually static for each of the other teams. There's some earlier logic that's a little bit hard to trace through, or maybe you ran it in a debugger, you could have found this, and you would see that you really kind of had to actually understand how was the random seed being generated, how is it being applied to each one of these key generation, and you'd see, like, wait a minute, no matter what I put in here for this random value, that each team gets the same big prime factor. Now it's different per team, so it's not like one for all of them, but each team is going to have a different big prime factor, and these other two are real small. So we could actually kind of factor that, right? I think I heard you say, like, it really only took a couple minutes.
Yeah, I believe
It was about 10 minutes
Yeah.
on a decent computer.
Yeah, and I think most teams have like some big compute, right?
Right.
Like,
And think about it in terms of real world, it's more like, weeks and days and years and for some numbers. And so we intentionally made these something that was a tractable problem that could be solved in a CTF.
And I think that's a good point to mention too, right? Is that when you have when you have a challenge that you're trying to scope for the course of a weekend, too hard and too easy are both cliffs you don't want to fall off of. You got to really walk that line and keep it like at the right difficulty level. And so I think that finding this is the hard part. You didn't want to make people have to just sit there and wait hours while their rented GPU compute cluster cracks numbers or tries to factor these numbers. So that makes a lot of sense. All right, so these three numbers that were factored, that let the teams essentially impersonate other teams, and that's I think the cool part. So if we come back over to our kind of like our roadmap, that's sort of like the answer here, right? And we're gonna in a second we're gonna play the official like intro video. We're gonna remind people of like what this user segment ground station kind of challenge was. But this time we're gonna give you we played this yesterday, but now we're gonna play it with a little bit more context. So you're gonna have kind of the official answer. We've kind of walked through it a little bit now. Now that they've figured out what these prime factors are, they can create the keys, they can impersonate other teams, and that lets them use this radio link to talk to the other teams. So let's go ahead and go to that explanation video, and we'll learn more about that.
Here's what we know. Once a team has restored their satellite to full operation, they should verify the correct behavior of the main payload, a communications system, by communicating with it using a shared user segment ground station. Teams received a software utility and an associated configuration file to send commands to the communications payload through the user segment ground station. The mission. Teams need to analyze the provided utility for vulnerabilities and possibly use it to co-opt the user segment ground station to send commands to other teams' satellites. Here's how they do it. The user segment uses public key infrastructure, or PKI, to protect and authenticate an incoming command with a particular team and destination satellite. Teams encrypt and sign their messages with their private key, and the user segment uses its database of public keys to verify the message before routing it for transmission to its intended satellite's communications payload. The software utility provided to the teams includes the algorithm used to initially generate these sets of PKI keys. By reverse engineering the utility, teams discovered that the keys have a weakness and use this information to search the public key list to discover the other team's private keys.
So again, that's how these teams now were able to start talking to these other satellites. They had to reverse engineer that particular piece of software, figure out the flaw in the crypto.
Hold on,
hold
on, Jordan.
Go ahead, Jason.
You mentioned reverse engineering there, and I don't know if all of our viewers fully understand that. And this is one of the primary activities that our teams would be doing throughout the competition. So maybe you can kind of explain, because you went through that very quickly.
Let's go back to the computer and let's try this again, and I'll try to go a little slower. I get excited and we have all sorts of cool stuff, but I think we want to do this right. You're right. So let's step back a little bit, right? So I said I'm looking through the binary, I'm looking at the code.
But you would be looking at something that the organizer would have provided.
That's right.
That they would have had access
to.
So
this is the compiled. So the organizers, you guys, someone on your team, so John on your team, I think, worked with one of the other engineers and built this challenge, wrote some source code, compiled a binary, and this binary is meant to run and communicate legitimately from each team to their own satellite. But it had a flaw built in so that you could talk to these other satellites. And that's the trick, is each team has to figure out, how do we talk to these other satellites? And so, when I started like what we call as the main. This is like the entry point. It's the very beginning. When you just run the program, it's the first thing that's going to happen. And I kind of just skimmed through this. And this is, I guess, a good summary. When you're reverse engineering, you are the most important skill, especially for a CTF.
Yeah, I would
right,
say
where
in the
it's-
competition, you're
yeah.
very time limited.
And actually, there's some
Right.
people who are really good at reverse engineering that are not good at reverse engineering in a CTF because like
Absolutely.
a long term. And I am not a
Time
good
pressure.
reverse engineer at long term stuff, especially. But quick stuff, I can sometimes fumble my way through it. And so it's all about figuring out what to ignore. And so I see like all of these functions that are like C++, these long big names, these classes, and standard library things. And so kind of just skimming over and ignoring most of that stuff because that's just like boring string stuff. It's like making new strings, and I can see what these strings are. That it's just like help information, and it's pulling out details that it's parsing. So I'm kind of looking for like where's the meat of it? Like where's something that's kind of interesting. And so as I'm scanning through, I cheated a little bit, right? Like obviously I knew going into this I had a couple minutes to practice. So the first time I went through this, it was 20-30 minutes of like somebody else sitting down with me, and as we kind of talked through it, I was going through it to kind of get a sense of what it was doing. And I sort of knew the answer going in, so that obviously helps a lot. But as a team, and actually I think it was it 4 total teams? I know at least 4 teams. What was the
At
final
least
count?
4.
There were 4 teams that were able to solve this and were successfully impersonating other teams throughout the event. And so we know for a fact that there definitely were teams that were solving this. And there may have been more that would have. We'll talk in a little bit about the kind of the ending of this particular challenge and how we moved on to other ones and why that happened. But like what I'm doing is I'm just kind of scanning through, and it is this first other class, this user segment packet, which I kind of just stopped on for a second. That does stand out because that's like not the standard boilerplate. Another thing to mention is these names. The fact that I can even see that this is a user segment packet is kind of you all being nice.
That's correct.
And because like some challenges, this is what we call it stripping the binary, right? You take away all the names and you just get like, I called this other bit of code over here. Good luck figuring out what it does. And so having that extra information, so there's different levels of, I guess, how nice you want to be.
Yeah, and as the organizers, that's one aspect where we can kind of tweak some difficulties.
Yeah.
And as challenge authors, like you mentioned earlier, they have to evaluate how much time do we want these challenges to take. What is the level of the competitors that we have in this competition? In Hackasat, we're talking very high-level competitors, but we still only had 24 hours to get through all of these challenges. So if we make them too difficult, make it so that we strip the binary so that information isn't available to them, and that might cause those challenges to take longer.
It definitely makes it a lot harder. You could have also made one step easier, like by including debug information too, right? Which would give even more details about variables and names and types, and it would have make it even cleaner kind of look at. So it is like a little sliding scale, and that's where like play testing and evaluating and having other people check it out, and that's probably the hardest part, I think, actually, about running a challenge.
This is one of those challenges that's a gateway to other challenges, and we didn't want to stymie everyone so long that they didn't get to the more juicy things to come.
That's a great segue. So I think in lieu of spending more time reverse engineering this, let's talk about that a little bit. So let's go back to our map again, and I'm going to queue up the video for the computer next, so we can go back to that. But on the map, again, this is how teams are talking to those other satellites. And the rest of the challenges we're starting to, like the next few challenges are all in the other team's satellites and all about figuring out how to exploit things over there. And so if you didn't have access to this, if you didn't have the ability, you kind of get stuck there forever. So I think there was already like a planned-in, built-in deadline for this challenge. And so actually let's switch over to that, the score graph, and we can see again, right about 10 o'clock last night Pacific time, right? That's when we have this little asterisk here. Challenge 3 ended, but it didn't really end, right? Because teams are still using that. What happened was instead there were no more points given for it. Every team was given every other team's key so they could kind of move on to the next thing. And all the teams that were able to score earlier and get all those points had a built-in benefit for the whole rest of the game because they got points that the other teams couldn't get. And now it was up to everybody to sort of move on to the next challenge. Let me make sure. I'm going to look at my notes real quick and double check. We got all of our stuff. I think that's everything we wanted for Challenge 3. Anything I missed?
Oh, I think that's good.
All right, great. So let's go back again. We're kind of like that was all the way through Challenge 3. Let's step back a little bit and look at Challenge 4, which we call Payload Access. Let's go ahead and play the intro video that we've got for Challenge 4. Kind of, again, this is kind of like the summary information for that one.
Here's what we know. With the ability to send messages via the user segment ground station to any other team's communications payload, there is a new opportunity to attack the opposing satellites. The first step is to gain a foothold on a satellite by exploiting a vulnerable service. The most obvious place to start looking is at the payload module itself, since it communicates directly with the user segment ground station. Teams are provided the latest flight software running on the communications payload to analyze it for vulnerabilities. There is also an opportunity for teams to read telemetry coming from other teams, which can give information on how exploitation is going.
All right, so that was the payload access challenge. Again, let's go back to our our map, because I think that helps me figure this out. And Jason, Steve, you guys help me. So we've called this payload access. We've called this challenge number 4. Like, where in our diagram? Actually, let's go ahead and label. I'm going to go ahead and label 1 and 2. Right, we're down here, which we called first things first. Those were living in the kind of. It was actually the flat side itself, but the teams had to configure it and set it up through the Cosmos ground station. Right. So, but as we move now into that user segment server, that was the radio that was using the radio link to communicate, and that was number 3. So now we're moving into challenge 4. And so that's like a new challenge. Teams are told, hey, there's something. Yeah, walk me through that. Like, what does it happen? You tell the teams like, hey, there's something going live, and then they got to find it, or how did that work?
Yeah, so we have the Slack channel that we communicate over, and so we would let them know that a challenge is available, or in some cases they would see that challenge is available, and we may not, immediately announce that. So, and we also gauge the progress of the teams, and we provide hints as well as needed. So, because sometimes the teams aren't making progress, and we're on a time schedule here, and we kind of want to see teams make it through all of these challenges.
You want to have them have a chance to look at everything. Absolutely, yeah. And if they're going too slow or too fast, either one can be a problem.
And we don't want to give a hint if some team is really close.
Yeah.
So we really communicate with them regularly to make sure that we don't.
I saw that. I liked it. I would see one of you pop and ask a question like, "What are your thoughts on this challenge, and do you have an approach?" And if somebody says like, "I'm almost there," you give them time, you let them go it. But if nobody has any clue, you don't want everyone spinning the wheel. And as soon as somebody solved it, no more hints. It's clearly solvable. You let them go, and it's up to them to kind of figure that out. So that makes sense. All right. So number 4, we're moving in. Where on our map is number 4? Where are we talking about? Again, this is the payload access challenge.
Yeah, number 4 is on the top board here.
Okay. So we're looking at the physical flats that you've got there.
And actually, I think, Steve, it's probably on your side. If you can point to it, there's a Raspberry Pi compute module, which was where it was actually running.
Well, it's actually on the underside of this board here. It's a
I see it.
It's a little daughter board on here.
A little hard to see, a little daughter board.
The radio on the ground was talking to the radio that's mounted to the
and we see the antenna sticking on the side. That's the radio, right?
But all the software, all the intelligence is actually running on the little CM4 module on the bottom.
Okay, so this and that's what we labeled on our diagram over here as COM payload, right? So we're calling that's the COM payload, and that's doing. So now that they're able to send these packets to the other system, they've got to exploit it, right? Like they've got to figure out how to get an exploit into the system. How would you generically describe this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, so I would describe the challenge itself was a message parsing service.
Okay.
So they could send, over their radio link, they could send a packet to this service, and the service would process it. And the service itself was, had the ability for you to segment messages, and it would parse those individual segments of those messages.
This is a thing that I would imagine pretty much every satellite's going to do. Very common, right?
In your cell phone, that's exactly what happens. Packets come and they get broken up, and they have to sometimes come in out of order and have to be reassembled. So we created a very toy example of that for this service.
All right, so they've got this radio link. They're sending packets to that parser, but there's a vulnerability in it. There's a flaw in it. How do I actually exploit that though? What do I, as a competitor, what does an exploit look like?
Yeah, this is a CTF obviously, so there's going to be a vulnerability. In this case, it was a heap buffer overflow. So they actually had the opportunity to. Actually, I don't think it was a heap overflow. It was a use after free.
Okay.
And so
but you're going to still have to manipulate the heap.
You're and that was the key to this challenge. That it required them to manipulate the heap, which also meant that the teams that were solving it had many different solutions to this problem. And something that actually created some interesting game aspects overnight that I think we would like to talk about.
All right, so before we get to that, I'm with you. I think there's some really, really cool stuff there. Again, that heap, so let's talk about the heap, just real briefly for maybe our non-technical side of the audience. Your computer has memory, right? It used to be like a stat, like how many gigs of memory or RAM do you have in your computer or your phone? And that's just basically where when you go to a web page, it's going to get downloaded into your memory. Your hard drive is where things are saved, so if you turn your computer off, everything on your hard drive is saved. But while you're running, when you load a program, when you go to a web page, all that information gets loaded up into RAM. And the heap is like, it's just a heap. It's like a pile of stuff. And there's something that's going to control where everything goes. You just, as code running, you say, hey, I've got an image or I've got a message coming from thing, I need this many bytes or I need this much memory. Can you give me some memory? And it would say, sure, put it here. And so when you talk about like a use after free, that's where this system that's tracking where stuff lives has said, give me some memory, it's using it, and then later on it says, okay, I'm done with it, but then it uses it again, right? So it says, I'm done with this memory, but something else could have gone there, and now you're working with garbage or different data. And so when you talk about like a use after free bug, I'm thinking, okay, so there's you've got to like groom the heap, you've got to manipulate, you've got to make different allocations potentially, you've got to like get a particular pattern. Is that like basically what the teams were doing on this challenge? Okay, so we've got the teams going to have to build this exploit. And the first blood of this one came at about, I think I'm looking at 9:20 at night. So let's go ahead and pull up here on our graph. We'll skip forward, and we can see. And this is right before we sort of sunsetted 3 as a scoring thing. And this is kind of a common trend. You would sort of like move people along to like the next thing or open up the next thing. Although I think from here on out we tend to have things kind of longer running, but because again, for that one because it was foundational to accessing the rest of them, I think that makes a lot of sense. So we've got a little FB marker on our score graph, and this again stands for first blood. And so we're going to see pull and can, and so we should be able to see. I think pull and can is the where are they? The green bar right here. So they're in second, and we should see again the slope of their line start to converge a little bit faster. We see a little bump actually from SolarWine. So. Oh, there we go, and look at that. You can see in this graph the lead is very much changing, and so we've got much closer. So it also, though, I think this isn't probably solely related to the scoring on that particular challenge, because I do note we're also in the battery alert section of the game. So we've kind of tagged this up top. We have this big bar that's saying battery alert. This is when sort of everybody became aware of like, oh wait. This is going to cause us problems, right? We've got to worry about our battery. Tell me a little bit about like kind of the battery mechanics or how teams had to deal with that.
Well, this is satellites, right? Satellites don't get plugged into the wall. They have to run off batteries, and those batteries get charged by the sun. And so it's a big important part that they have to be able to manage their power and utilize it effectively. And so sometimes that means you turn things off when your power's getting low, or you steer your satellite, you point it where you're getting maximum sun on your solar panel so you get maximum charging. Well, maybe the teams weren't used to that kind of dynamic. In a typical CTF, they were going against a server or a virtual machine. And so I think some of the teams might have been ignoring that aspect of satellites until it became suddenly very apparent that, wait a minute, our battery is, although we keep charging, the overall trend is lower, and that was by design.
Yeah.
That was intentionally built in by us that, if after 7, 8, 9 hours, their batteries are going to be critically low if they hadn't been paying attention to it.
Yeah, and I really liked that this was, this was hard, and there was, different teams it definitely impacted teams, and that some teams were hit, and it caused them to, kind of talk about like what happened when they hit that point. But this is very much a sort of like unnumbered challenge. It didn't directly, you weren't being graded directly on your battery, but there's just real world implications. There's natural consequences. If your system loses its power, in a real satellite, you're gonna have to go into recovery mode. It shuts everything down until it's got enough of a charge. And so these are like things that weren't explicitly called out. There's a little bit of hand-holding where you're telling teams, okay, there's a new challenge, you got to worry about this, but like that was one that you kind of had to figure out yourself. And I think about that 9:20 mark was when we actually had PPP as the first team to really be negatively impacted by that, where their system went into sort of recovery mode, they were sort of powered down. And the way that we actually should be able to scroll back on the scoreboard, we can even see here, we should probably see, so this is when we had this really tight cluster. So SolarWine had really pulled out a little bit. I think we've seen that because they had really good implementation of their Challenge 3, so they were throwing against everyone every round and relatively early. And they were the first ones to solve that. They also had very, very good SLA, so they had not disrupted, caused anything to go down. They had kept their systems up. The battery, they had no problems with battery. Everything was going fine, and so they were like kind of pulling away. We had this cluster in the middle with 4 of the teams, and then we had 2 more. Is it 4 or 5? I think it's 5 then in the middle. Right, 5 in the middle. There's kind of overlapping even there. Very, very close race until the battery is going to impact PPP. So we're going to see them in the kind of pink color Actually, oh, never mind. PP was where were they? Looking for them. Yeah, PP, we're going to start to see drop off at the bottom here. They were actually clustered down in those lower 3. They were, I think, in 6th place, dropped to 8th place, down 2 spots as a result of that. And then they kind of picked it back up again. So you can see they suffered this big down spike on their score just because they weren't online, and so that really is going to impact them. Tell me about some of the different strategies I think teams use for power over the course of the competition. What did you see them doing?
Yeah, so we actually, it was really interesting to us, because this was one of the areas where we could actually really observe the deltas that between the teams. So we were monitoring their telemetry data, and we could actually see certain teams were commanding their satellites directly. And this was a technique one team employed, where they shut down some of their like star tracker and
They shut
sun
down
sensor.
actually all of their sensors.
Oh, that was PFS, right? Where they were
Yeah,
essentially
they shut down all of their sensors,
Yeah.
and they were manually piloting their satellite. And so they were steering it towards the sun, and they actually had created a more optimal algorithm than the ones we had programmed into our flight software. So they were able to maintain their battery effectively without actually impacting anything really to them and their services and their availability. And
let me
likewise,
Go ahead.
PPP later, after their battery situation, they employed a much better algorithm as well, and so they didn't have that problem again after they did that.
Let's go ahead and actually take a look, because we got some screenshots from your team. You sent this over to me, and so we can take a look at this, because I think this is kind of fun. So the first one, I'm not gonna call out by name who this one was. I don't actually know offhand. This is one that was kind of considered bad power, right? So we're seeing like a not real healthy amount of power levels. It's going to swoop down. They're potentially shutting things off.
Yeah, and remember, it's going in the sun, and then it's being eclipsed.
Right.
So you'll
Right.
see moments where the battery is charging, right, by the solar panels, and then you'll see that drop. And it's what we were noticing is kind of that degree of that slope. So on the upswing, they're getting back to this high water mark, and each time some of the teams that were mismanaging their battery power would keep getting to a lower and lower high water mark, and their
so
low water
overall
mark,
they're trending downward in
they're
those
trending
little
down.
cycles. Yeah.
Yep. And when we basically told them if they get below 10%, and this is not uncommon on a system, that it would shut down. And so we shut it down for 20 minutes, which had a pretty big impact to their score overall, but it is representative of how a system would behave.
I think getting a repair boat out there and giving them a new charge in 20 minutes was pretty quick,
generous.
It was
actually.
pretty impressive. I don't think SpaceX could have pulled that off.
I think that you're going to beat most anybody's launch time and retasking, I'm sure. So looking at this particular chart here, so this is, and now you guys can't see it unfortunately, but this is the Cosmos kind of battery view, I think, right? So this is the ground station itself pulling all this telemetry data back out, and is showing us a couple different things. We've got a solar array power, which is kind of in yellow, and that's just showing how much volts, I guess, they're pulling out of how much they're getting from the sun.
It's not
It's
volts.
The, it's the illumination, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So explain that to me a little bit more.
Well, it's all about incident angle of light, right?
Okay.
So if
Yeah,
the
if you're
solar panels,
perfectly perpendicular, you're going to get the most.
You're getting maximum
Okay.
power transfer, right? So if teams again are managing their power, they're realizing they're coming out of eclipse. Eclipse is when they're being hidden from the sun by the Earth, and so when they're coming out of eclipse, they do something actively to steer their satellite to point those solar panels directly at the sun, maximum power.
That makes sense.
Teams not doing that are going to be getting less optimal power if they're not paying attention.
And you said even sort of relying on like the default sensors and automation, which do exist. You can do nothing, and the satellite will kind of on its own find its way there. Just wasn't quite as effective, as efficient as something that was really well tuned. And I'm curious to talk to some of these teams. Like, did they really have somebody kind of figuring that? How long was it? Was it fully automated? I assume they just figured out and did the math and really got.
We saw teams doing things like because some teams, like Jason mentioned, had come up with their own steering algorithm, and they were basically manually sending quaternion commands to orient their satellite optimally to the sun, and it was impressive to see. Others were. We could even see it as their battery was getting closer to that threshold of 10% where we were going to unplug it. They started panicking, turning things off, and
yeah.
And others, we'd look at, 'cause we were watching the telemetry pretty closely, and they'd be in eclipse and still were running their reaction wheels and still doing all these things that were having zero effect.
I remember seeing one team even comment like, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe we should stop aiming at the sun when we're behind the Earth. Like we're not getting any power, but we're moving the system around, and we're going to waste a lot of energy doing that."
Right, exactly. So it was fun to watch because just from also at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're looking for anything to keep yourself entertained, right?
Yeah,
but
I think it should. Again, that's what we were really hoping is personality. I talked at the beginning about like there's just a lot of differences, a lot of opportunities for teams to distinguish themselves. I think as we saw PFS really early understood this and had really, again, optimal, better than kind of the automation. Some of the other teams, I think we saw like Veltalis, for example, had pretty good like just stability and reliability at the beginning. They ended up, as we saw the scoreboard later, not kind of maintaining by maybe not getting some of the exploits, but it seemed like they're early on anyway, we're doing particularly well.
We were watching them in particular because at some point they were bitten by this. They hit the 10% threshold and were shut off. And we're watching the telemetry and we're rooting for them. Like, we don't see any command. We don't see any commands.
Yeah,
I mean,
you
come on,
want to see like do something. What are you doing?
What are you doing? Right. Well, meanwhile, there's another satellite at the same time. Within 5 minutes, they both went into that power shutdown. And we could see them actively trying to manage their power.
I think that was SolarWind, if memory serves, right?
Correct.
So this was actually one we're going to see later on the graph. Yeah, where SolarWind, again, it was the leader up until this point, is going to take a hit to their SLA because they had the same problem. So they were trying, but it was ineffective. They were still not able to kind of come out of the tailspin and get it. So we're going to see that impact. Let me switch over a couple images more. So again, this was the sort of like one of the worst ones. Here's PFS, which we mentioned. They had a really nice kind of like this pretty like keeping high levels out of the solar panel and just really constant, nice positive slope on the charging. And we can see at the very end of the graph, it's just starting to come down. So I think, Steve, it's about 90 minutes was sort of like the orbit that they were in.
Typical LEO orbit's 90, 94 minutes.
Okay, so are they out of the sun for the same amount of time, or is it just like a smaller period of time?
It's really going to depend on where they are in their orbit, right? Because the orbits, they have an inclination, so they're not like there's a sun synchronous orbit. We are always in the sun, like weather satellites are in a sun synchronous orbit, so they always have power.
And each team was sort of nominally into this. I mean, obviously they're physically behind us, but each team was in the same sort of imaginary orbit, as it were, so that they had the same exposure to the sun, the same amount of time in the shade, essentially.
Right.
Cool. All right. So we'll look at this last one because again, you mentioned PPP really like tuned it by the end. So PFS pretty early on had great power, but then we saw PPP with just fantastic, right?
What's cool about PPP is there was a little Easter egg that one of our designers did for them. Solar panels are double-sided, right?
Yeah.
So there was actually a larger solar panel array on the back side of the main panel. They figured that out either through looking at the simulation in NASA 42 or somewhere.
Or experimentally even, right?
Or maybe experimentally. And what they found is they rotated their satellite 180 degrees and illuminated the backside. They got more power.
Yeah.
And at that point, they actually got their battery to completely topped off. And that was the first team that had ever done that.
Yeah, the other teams had made it last longer, kept it even. PFS with their really nice tuning and aiming was able to get good, but they didn't do nearly as well as PPP because they figured out that trick. So PPP went from first team that was impacted by a power outage to like far and away the most like they learned that. They definitely got that down there. Okay, so we mentioned earlier too. Let me actually go back to the scoreboard. And we're gonna take a look at this. Just looking at the battery, I think it was around 10:30 p.m. Pacific that we had both Veltalis and SolarWind, if memory serves right.
This is going to be precise, 10:28 and 10:34.
So yeah, you can tell somebody who was watching the clock because again they were sort of like they suffered offline, they got the repair, and you were very precise about when they got kind of back online. So we're going to see. The slopes are going to change a little bit. Kind of the wiggling of the scoreboard. There's a big flattening. As the scores update to show us that SolarWind is still in the lead, but wow, they got real close, right? And so we see Poland Can coming up very, very close to them in terms of into the score. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. We kind of sidetracked with power, and I want to make sure we covered everything for Challenge 4 because I think there's still a couple more details that we want to talk about. Challenge 4 again was that heap exploit where the teams are kind of sending a number of packets. How many packets did it take to exploit this about, like give or take?
That's a great question actually because we solved it in around 22 packets, I believe. We were seeing some teams throwing upwards of 50 plus packets.
And remember, this is a rate-limited link, so
right.
that matters.
And so you can't attack all of your competitors if you're sending too many packets.
Yeah, we were limiting the originating teams, to 1 packet per second that they could throw on the user segment. So if they wanted to attack all 7 other teams, and they had 50 seconds or 50 packets as fast, they couldn't accomplish this.
Because they had a scoring round that's
6 minute scoring,
6 minute
scoring intervals, a
scoring
packet
round
per second, exactly 60 packets per exploit, and math that net up. You don't have 7 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, and so some other teams found where they were initially throwing longer, shell code, I guess, that they were doing, or their method of exploiting,
the
heap grooming. and then they were refining that and lowering that, and then eventually we would see them where they were getting it down to where it was very optimal. They could hit all the teams in one round. You could see them jumping from one team to the next. They're kind of just rotating through the list.
They clearly implemented automation with their throwing system, right? And so we would see them continue to refine that. At first they would send against one satellite until they finished it, and then there would be a gap. And they would send against another. Well, those gaps kept getting smaller as they were trying to see where the boundaries were. And then PPP in particular parallels everything. They were at some point throwing against 4 or 5 satellites at once.
Yeah, so it was able just to, it was clearly a tool that was able to distribute it, that had an efficient exploit. And I think that you mentioned a throwing framework. Let's back up a little bit for the audience a little bit, because that's something unique to, I think, an attack defense competition. Most CTFs, you solve something once and then you're done. You've got the flag and it's over. And the whole point of attack defense is that it's a constant battle. And that's why even though there is a sort of smaller number of challenges that are being solved here compared to something like a calls event that has 30 or 40 challenges maybe, it's not a static environment. Your opponents are changing. What they're doing is changing. The environment's changing. Things are being added and removed. And so even though we sort of look at these total number of challenges as small, the actual ways you interact with them are constantly shifting. And so it's like a bunch of little micro challenges, even aside from things like I said, the battery, where it's not officially a challenge, but it's going to directly impact you because of that SLA impact. And so a throwing framework is what you as a team will actually build to automate the exploitation of your competitors, right? So it's the thing going out. And so again, it kind of makes sense that PPP, who is the winningest team of all time at DEF CON CTF, the most famous attack defense competition, which both of you were former organizers of. I want to give credit for that. And this year we're all curious to see who is going to be the DEF CON organizers. So maybe when DT is on later, we can ask him about that, and he'll give us a hint. We'll see. But again, DEF CON is one of the most famous attack defense competitions, and PPP has tons of experience. So I'm not at all surprised that they would really both have a throwing framework kind of ready and also be quick to implement that to build this automation. But I also think it's important to talk. That you mentioned it's an iterative process. You don't just write an exploit and you're done. In fact, if we had seen some of those teams that had the bigger, inefficient, slower exploit really hone and work on it, they would have gotten more points over time. It would have actually helped them out either to grow a lead or to gain on their competitors. All right, so I think that takes us through. Is there anything else that we want to cover on Challenge 4? Do we miss anything?
There was, I think, one notable event. One of the teams figured out that they could actually patch their command and data handler.
Yes.
Because again,
that's
they're
going to be
coming
next, right, for Challenge 5 though?
This was affected Challenge 4 actually. So the packets come in through the RF link and are processed on the comm payload board, but then they have to get out. They have to get back to them, and they came back over telemetry.
Okay, so let me show my map while you talk,
Yes.
right? And let's talk this through. So
Yeah.
So again, the exploits are coming in over the radio.
Yep.
They're first landing on the comm payload.
Over here, yep.
But now they've got to get. How do you if you and a flag? We even talked about flags.
Yes.
So let's talk about flags.
Sure.
What does a flag look like for these particular challenges?
So on this particular challenge, the flag was actually an environment variable that was loaded into memory.
And it's changed every scoring?
Every scoring round,
so every
the
6
flag
minutes.
was updated. And the flag is unique among the teams. And so
Each team and each service. So
correct.
There's like
Each
this
team and
matrix
each
of them.
service.
Okay.
And that is so that when they retrieve that flag by proving some type of vulnerability and exploiting it, they then submit it to us, the organizers, and we can score them for that. And we consider that a capture, or capture the flag, hence the name.
That's where it comes from.
And so that was, that's basically how this particular service worked. We had other services as well, for instance, like Challenge 1 and 2, which were SLA
We're
checks.
SLA down here, right?
Yep.
So those are down here in the ground station. But from these later ones that are exploits, they've got to get a flag. So that flag, so the flag lives inside of one of these components up here, but they've got to get it back out.
Yes.
And like I see the only arrow pointing out of this is coming down here. Right?
RF link was one direction.
Yep.
And so they had to get it actually back out through their telemetry. And so
so
that involved.
So telemetry, I don't know the details. What is telemetry? Is just like status updates, information coming out from the satellite?
Steve handle this one.
Well, telemetry is just basically all of the pertinent stats about the satellite, right? Everything from its voltages on its batteries, its temperatures on its systems, what things are turned on,
So those
turned
graphs
off.
we saw were from the ground station,
Absolutely.
rendering the results of telemetry data coming
Right.
back out of the satellite.
And,
So it's just
and
always.
there is just hundreds of telemetry items available on the satellite that are coming down, and every subsystem on a satellite is going to communicate through the command and data handler board.
Okay,
right?
so
or that
we got our map.
process.
So all the information, we've got a little flag, Oh, I apologize for my little bad drawings. So the flags are going to live in these components, and they're going to come, you said, through command and data handling.
Yeah, everything passes through command and data handling to get down through telemetry.
Okay, so that's what's going
And
to get
that's
through
important.
here, and it comes into this Cosmos ground station, and then that's where the API, right? So this
Yes.
is the API server is going to actually be where this stuff goes, and that's there. I would assume partly so that like there was a way for teams to kind of get access to this, like
Right.
you've got to be able to get the data out. So there was,
Right.
but they had to find that. That's why we
Yeah.
didn't have it on the graph yesterday. We couldn't reveal this earlier that there is this other server that you can query you can get telemetry from your opponents.
Yes.
So
And
I think we even saw some teams put together battery graphs of their own for all the other
Right.
teams.
Yeah,
Right?
they
were
did actually.
They were tracking this stuff.
They
too.
were tracking the
yes.
other teams' batteries, and they were curious as to how other teams were doing
Yeah, like
better.
how are they getting so much
Yeah,
better?
what
Well,
are they
go ask
doing?
PPP for their algorithm because
Yeah.
it's really good. You should get theirs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Probably wouldn't share with you in the middle of the
Yeah,
competition.
and this,
though.
and again, it's not uncommon for that telemetry link sometimes to be available, right? It's RF downlink from the satellite. So,
Yeah, so that makes sense. Like a read, it's not sensitive. It's just a bunch
Yeah.
of status information, so that I could see that
Correct.
that just being something you can pull off the air and you can
Yes.
actually read that.
So
That
they
makes a
could
ton of
they could
sense.
subscribe and they could receive other teams' telemetry data.
So that was done through this API
Correct.
server here. So that's where you're getting the flags. Oh, but wait a minute. This reminds me of something else we haven't talked about, right? So, okay, I write an exploit for this challenge 4. It lives in the COM payload. There's a flag in memory. It's going to come back. I'm reading it from the telemetry, but you just said all teams can access the telemetry, right?
Yes.
So doesn't that mean like one team
We might
can
be
steal-
jumping ahead here because I don't know. I really, I think we went from the attack defense, and then we were going to talk about the defensive aspect to also the fact that the teams could potentially see these flags coming over the air. So I don't know which
you
one
wanna
you
go
want
back?
to talk
You
about. I think we might go back.
Let's go back.
first.
Let's go back. Let's talk about defense because we did say this is an attack defense competition,
Right.
and some of this stuff, they don't have permissions to just replace things, and it's like, so what can you do to like patch yourself? So you're a system administrator, you're
Well-
trying to protect yourself. What do you do?
Well, as Jason mentioned earlier, we're in pretty constant communication with the teams. We have private Slack channels, so they're asking us questions if they see something that doesn't look right or they don't understand something. And we noticed that one team was saying, "Hey, I'm not getting flags from these 3 other teams." Well, we as the organizers knew that 2 of those teams were powered off because they had not managed their battery properly. But one of them we knew was up, and they're like, we could see their exploit being thrown, we could see a flag being sent to the CNDH, and we were like, well, they should be getting that. And we went and started looking, and sure enough, they weren't. And then we noticed something else happening. That team had been sending another set of commands to their own satellite, directly accessing memory in the CNDH, and they were writing to memory. And what they were
Okay.
doing is they were overriding the flags as they were being deposited. They were overriding them with zeros, so other teams couldn't get their flags.
All right, so and this was Team SolarWine, if memory serves,
This is
right?
correct.
Yes. So Team SolarWine, who was in the lead, and this is probably one of the ways they protected that lead throughout parts of the game, because we're saying, and this I think occurred. We saw this. This was around, actually right around where we're at on the score graph. If you want to go to that briefly, this was I think around 2 a.m. ish this morning. I think Pacific
Right.
time, right? We somewhere 1:30 to 2 was the time frame, and that's right when we had Pole and Can really coming up on them, closing the gap in them, and we could see that probably protected them because, as we said earlier, attack and defense, the scores for each of these rounds are calculated based on the flags lost and flags gained. And so if I'm stealing from other people, but I'm also losing flag, so I'm going to, the score is calculated kind of accounting for both of those. But if I'm defensive, even if I'm not exploiting people, I'm not losing my flags, and I'm also preventing my opponents from gathering them all. So best case scenario, I exploit every other team, I get all their flags, no one else gets any flags that round, I get a big bucket of points, right? That's the maximum you can get. There's that could potentially be big swings, especially when you do that over multiple rounds. And then once everybody's either patched or everyone's all exploiting it, like if every team exploits the same service, I think it's a net no gain.
Right.
Like
If
nothing
everybody
happens
patches,
because
there's
it
no
just
gain.
redistributes the points evenly. Yeah? So
Right.
that's the
And at this point in the night, this 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning time frame, 4 of the teams were very regularly exploiting all the other teams, except for SolarWine.
they couldn't actually take those points. So SolarWine is one of the teams that's doing the exploitation.
Right.
They have a working exploit. Although I think theirs was also one of those that was less efficient, right? So maybe was it them
No,
or
no,
am I
no, theirs was actually
good.
yeah,
Okay,
theirs was
so
good.
they got one of the good ones. So they're able to exploit, but they're not losing. So they're going to again kind of keep either grow the lead a little bit, or they're going to defend off if somebody else has, even in the face of SLA changes or other problems that they're running into.
And we as the organizers, we're trying to anticipate what the teams are going to do. And as they say in the military, no plan survives first contact. And sure enough, we did not foresee anyone using this particular command to do this action. So, as we're high-fiving because we think it's super cool. It's very creative, and that's what we like to see.
Yeah, it's interesting because if somebody actually attacks your infrastructure, DOSes things, that's very against the rules. It's very bad. But a really clever hack in all the positive senses of the word, we're all rooting for you too, because that was very well done, very much in the scope of the rules, very much allowed, and was absolutely part of the spirit. We wanted people to figure this out, and we even, I remember having some discussions earlier where we talked about what are the defensive components, and there were some ways, you could even use the memory corruption from 4 to change, things in memory, but you have to rethrow against yourself, and that makes you've got to use some of your packets, or do you want what you can and can't do, maybe we want to let them do that. So there's all this discussion about that. It was great to see. So well done on SolarWine for doing that. Okay, so we got our defensive component. I'm trying to remember now. What were we going to go back to? We were going to talk about, the flags, right? So we got those flags, back out that telemetry information, and as far as we know, and this can be actually a little bit hard to figure out, right? Because we just get, did you submit a flag or not? And it's hard to know how you got them. But it would have been entirely possible for a team that had no idea how to do this exploit to pull telemetry data for all the teams and extract another team's flag, right? What prevents me from just stealing flags like that?
If they had done a very minimal, exploit, which is what we had done as our proof of, vulnerability, those flags are in the clear, so anybody could see them and submit them because it was the same for that one team. What they could do are take steps to obfuscate that flag in some way, XOR it or encrypt it or something like that. But that also would make your shellcode larger.
And so now you got more packets, which means you can send against less teams.
So,
and that I love the trade-offs, right? The game theory of CTF is one of the the technical aspects are a lot of fun, but the game theory of figuring out and trying to understand what's the optimum strategy is probably the hardest part, I think, in a lot of ways about it, what to do. So yeah, that was, and I think you saw, I remember you saying, you saw some people kind of trying it, considering it, and then sort of rolling the back, maybe making the decision. And I guess it was the right decision, again, because we didn't see other teams taking advantage of that and pulling out that telemetry data, using it to their advantage, because if they had, it could have kind of flattened that service and sort of nobody's really gaining over the other because they're all getting access to the flags, be it even just one team. One team could have been exploiting, every other team could have stolen the flags. So that was really cool. Again, super exciting to see that kind of overnight. So let's go back to the scoreboard and kind of let this play a little bit. We've made it all the way to 3 a.m. now, and again we're seeing shifts in score. These can become because of SLA, because of scoring events, and we've got the CNDH exploit, vulnerability, the challenge. There was a separate challenge pushed out a little bit before 4 a.m. It looks like, made available to the teams. So not too much earlier before the shut off of the scoreboard. So we know it went live, but we didn't actually see. I don't think we saw any solves against that. There were no teams that successfully exploited. We
know that some teams were close, and we were, again, we were periodically polling and seeing, all right, are you guys going to make it? Where are you at? And unfortunately, they didn't make it in time. But they were trying there at the end. So
I realized we skipped our Challenge 4 intro video. Let's go ahead and do our Challenge 5 intro video. This is our, if I can get the language right, the CNDH introductory video. Let's go ahead and refresh the audience. We'll just show just a quick summary of what this challenge, like I said, it got dropped at about 4 a.m.
Here's what we know. Exploiting the communications payload has given teams a foothold on the satellite's internal communications bus. They can now attempt to expand their access to other subsystems on the bus by finding vulnerabilities in those components and using the communications payload as their pivot. The Command and Data Handler, CNDH, is a key element of the satellite and handles all telemetry and command processing for the spacecraft. It's likely to be a good target for further exploitation.
All right, so that was the expanded access or the CNDH challenge. Again, nobody, I think, solved that, but either Jason or Steve, when do you want to kind of explain what the gist of that particular challenge was?
So I'll let Steve, you talk about how the CNDH and what its purpose is on the satellite.
Okay, yeah, I think we mentioned earlier that the command and data handler, that all communications are coming through that. So it's talking to the radios. In a typical actual satellite, there's going to be a radio system, and so commands coming from the ground are coming through it, and they're being distributed to the proper subsystem that's to receive that command. And then obviously all telemetry data is also being sent to it and then being sequenced to the ground. So it's obviously a very important part of the satellite.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust our diagram over here, and we're going to really, like, this arrow where we're coming from the ground station really is actually going through this component here, right? So we're actually going to go into the CNDH. All right, so it's doing all the processing. And we had an exploit here. Do we know about, like, again, the teams weren't able to do it in time, but do we have a quick summary of kind of what the vulnerability was?
Yeah, so so the CNDH is running RTEMS, which is a real-time operating system, and it's running NASA's core flight software. And there's an application on the CNDH that was vulnerable to a stack overflow. And so the teams had to craft an exploit that they would actually send through the user segment, through the COM payload, that could then access the CNDH application, the CFS application running on the CNDH, and then exploit that stack-based buffer overflow. And
on the wonderful Spark architecture.
Yes, on the wonderful Spark architecture.
I actually had somebody ask me, like, does Binary Ninja have support for Spark? And I was like, no support for Spark.
Which all the teams should be very familiar with at this point.
Right.
And because that was a part of the digital twin, right? They had
Yes.
access to that. And that's why, again, I was asked by one of the teams several days ago before the competition started. They knew that was part of the components. What they didn't have, though, was that binary, right?
Correct.
So you mentioned RTEMS. You said it's a real-time operating system. Can you kind of briefly summarize, like, what's, like, an operating system, right, runs my phone, it runs my laptop, but what makes something a real-time operating system?
And this has to do a lot with how the operating system itself behaves and how it handles task scheduling. So in a real-time operating system, those tasks are almost guaranteed to operate on a fixed schedule, and so they're essentially priority level tasks. On other operating systems, tasks may not necessarily occur at fixed intervals.
When I launch a program on Windows,
Yeah.
sometimes it's slower than others.
Exactly.
Right?
And it's very important for a satellite that we have a real-time operating system, because we have control algorithms that are running on this. And these control algorithms do require periodic updates, and they require those updates to occur at fixed time intervals.
Very precise time
Very
intervals.
precise.
So and that makes sense. I think you see, like, real-time operating systems are used in, like, these really critical environments where timing is important, where you have to get things kind of exactly right, where, like, I don't want to say about safety and security, but just in terms of the integrity of the system, right? Where they're really kind of, like, structured, and less any program can kind of do anything like the way you would on a
I mean, yeah, if you have a priority task that's running and it doesn't get service at the right time, especially one that's maybe calculating, the thrusters or things like that of a vehicle, that could cause the vehicle to behave in some unintended manner.
Okay, so we've got the CNDH running Spark with a real-time operating system, a new vulnerability in it. No one was able to exploit that, but we did launch another one as well, right? So let's go back and look at the scoreboard again real quick here. And we can see score is dark. Teams don't know what happens, but we have been announcing first blood. So when a team, the first team to solve something, I don't think we necessarily said who ever. We would just say something was solved, or maybe we said who before the scoreboard went dark. But once the scoreboard's dark, by the way, something was solved and no other information, which is just nerve-wracking. Like, as a team, I'm any of these teams, if I'm not the one that solved that, and even if I solved it, I don't know, did anyone else solve it right after me, or am I the only one? Can I exploit? How many of my teams can I exploit this against? So that's a little nerve-wracking. But I will say this is a really, really short kind of turnaround. So we have we exposed this challenge, this number 6. Which was ground segment. I think, what was the other name of it we may have had for this one?
That's ground station.
Ground
access.
station. Thank you. So so it was the ground station challenge. Let's go ahead and we'll do the quick summary. Oh wait, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do the summary of that one. Okay, we are going to do that. I'm getting mixed signals. I apologize. We're going to do a quick summary of that ground station video, and then we'll talk about the solution. And we'll kind of wrap it up with our technical overview of the event so far. So let's go ahead and take a look at that video.
Here's what we know. So far, teams have been using the shared user segment ground station to communicate with their opponent's satellites through the payload module. Access through the main command and telemetry channel uses the system's Cosmos ground station, but remote access is limited by network security. In addition to the raw telemetry service that is running, leadership has ordained additional functionality in the form of the telemetry reporting tool. The mission: teams need to analyze the code for the portal to see if any weaknesses could be found and exploited.
All right, so again, that was our ground station challenge, and it was launched at 8:20. Pull and Can had a solution in only 36 minutes. We knew this was an easy one. That's part of why, if it was a really hard one, you probably wouldn't even deploy it, I would say, like that close to the end, because it's just gonna make people spin their wheels. Can you guys tell me a little bit about like this type of challenge? Why was it so fast they were able to solve it, and what it kind of did?
Yeah, so this was a service that basically took an object and processed it, like pickled the object, and then it would execute it. So it was a really simple one. They had to create a reverse shell, connect back shell, and that's how they would be able to access and download their flag. So that's why it was probably solved in the time that it was.
And this was living on, so that API server we talked about before.
Yes.
So if we go back to our map, right down here, the API server, which had telemetry data coming back out, which is how they were stealing flags earlier. That server, they're told, hey, they're told a new service is kind of spun up. There's something available on it, and they pick it. And then very quickly, obviously, Pull and Cam was clearly familiar with that vulnerability type.
This one was a black box service, so we didn't give them the binary, but there was an exception that would occur when you would send malformed data to it.
And you could see it's Python.
Yeah, so you could see it was Python, and then you could
pickling.
use those exceptions to kind of lead you down the path that would lead to a working exploit.
Okay, so pickling, which we mentioned, let's just kind of summarize that really quick for the audience. Like a pickle, which is a weird word, I guess, in context. I don't know why why do programmers call it that, right? Is related to like taking some data and kind of like smushing it into another format and then kind of unsmushing it so you can work with it as a variable in memory, right? So maybe you want to write it to disk, you want to save it, and then load it again later. You would use the word serializing or pickling, and there's been a number. This is a really interesting vulnerability class because this is not a vulnerability class like the rest of all the vulnerabilities. All the rest of the vulnerabilities were either system level maintaining service status, or they were like memory corruption that was actually about like flaws in the way that like the nitty gritty CPU was working. And this is at more of a kind of a higher level language. Speaking of higher level languages, there is another like vulnerability that's been all in the news lately. The Log4j vulnerability that just kind of blew up this week, which is going to be super interesting watching. Like this is going to have a really long tail. If you have any system administration, if you're a network administrator, you have this somewhere probably on your network, and if you haven't already fixed this, go fix it. Like
at one point, I think we as organizers were briefly like, all right, do we have anything running Java in our infrastructure?
Right.
Because I fully anticipated teams to joke, maybe send it, but we did have in the rules that our infrastructure was off limits, and so. But we were briefly considering it, like, okay, would they, do this, and do we have this running in our infrastructure?
What's interesting about this vulnerability is that so Frank actually coined it. He called it a dandelion exploit, and I love that phrasing, right? Because this is not like a weapon that you shoot a bullet out a window and you're aiming and you're targeting and you attack.
Yeah.
This is you release the spores into the wild. And it's not necessarily the computer that you're talking to or the computer it's talking to, but like 10 computers later, some random piece of infrastructure like connects back to you because it saw this message. It's a fascinating kind of vulnerability. And it did turn out there was like some monitoring things that we had. Didn't impact the game, didn't have any even connection to the game where it could cause this, but we did see some of our stuff like flare. By the way, someone's trying to do this, and there was even a cute little message, I think.
Yeah, it was not malicious intent, right? It was just a cute message.
Yeah, so that was pretty hilarious, and it is worth pointing out. Again, I think that even though it was sort of funny in this context, the way it was done in the game, this vulnerability exists in a million different places. It's incredibly hard to find out. A lot of people aren't even aware. So even if you don't think you have any Java running anywhere in your environment, like you really need to take a look at this as a system administrator. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Really appreciate Crimeless for your hard work. Thank you to all of the teams. You guys have worked so hard. You've put a ton of effort in. A sleepless night is very, very difficult. I know it's always just the chaos and the confusion, and I've told people Attack Defense is my least favorite and my most favorite CTF at the same time, because it's the most stressful. It is like the most rewarding, but like it can be a real headache too. So thanks to all the teams. We may have one more thing. Yeah,
just one quick thing. Obviously Jason and I are sitting here, but shout out to our team. They worked super hard for months on this, and in particular, I'd like to call out Logan Finch He has had a new baby added to his family right before Thanksgiving. He's not able to be here, but this wouldn't have happened without him. So thank you, Logan. Appreciate
Logan.
all the hard work.
And again, the whole rest of the team. There's a lot of folks looking forward for people to like check out the credits for all the folks that have been involved. But yes, the Crimeless team in particular. How many total people do you have that have been kind of a part of this?
Well, for finals, it's been a core people of about 6. But
Yeah.
like to pull off quals, earlier this year, we had a dozen people.
Well,
cranking
these
out
yeah,
challenges.
this is a massive undertaking, and like it takes a whole lot of work to put this on. So thank you again for that. We do have a couple of more things that we're going to go ahead and talk about before we announce our winners coming up soon. So stay tuned while we go ahead and reset the stage and get things back as we continue the regularly scheduled broadcast.
All right, we are back from our short reset. That was really fascinating, getting inside the minds of the game organizers and get a lot more details about the game infrastructure. It just shows how complex this game really is. Don't worry if you weren't able to track all that information. It was a lot, but I encourage you to keep on educating yourself on it. All right, so for all of those that have been following HAS2 over the last year or so, you may have heard of the term Moonlighter thrown around. Now, this is something that's really going to change the game and take CTFs to a whole new level. So let's take a short clip at this and we'll get into Moonlighter.
Yeah, so securing space through cybersecurity. Well, we've all been talking about this whole weekend. It's a really hard problem, as was described earlier through the different solves. So, how do we ensure that the designs and builds we've been working on are actually effective? What does space cyber test and that capability even look like? These are all things that we're trying to get after with Project Moonlighter, an actual satellite and cyber sandbox in space.
Wait, is that what this thing is behind us?
So Moonlighter is going to be significantly smaller than what you see here, as cool as this graphic is. With that, Moonlighter is going to bring a level of realism never before experienced in space cyber CTFs. Competitors will not only have to win through the physics of on-orbit satellites, they'll also have to work through limited ground contacts, just like our space operators go through on a daily basis.
So you're saying Moonlighter is going to be the first platform in space for a CTF?
Yes, Moonlighter is going to be the culmination of multiple years worth of work through the HackaSat campaign. It's going to be a true first of its kind on-orbit hackable satellite. It's a really cool pathfinder, and we are super excited to bring this capability to bear, meaning bringing it on orbit in 2023. We're also not only excited to leverage Moonlighter during HackaSat, but also the other 51 weeks of the year to do other things like CTFs, like training, like academic work. There is no limit to what you could do with this sort of capability. And when it's not actually in operation for these types of events, it's going to have a day job. It's going to have some pretty sweet technology on it that we're going to put to use to get, real use out of it. So we talk real satellite, we mean it is a real satellite.
All right, folks, you heard it. It's now written in stone. Moonlighter is the real deal, and it will be before us right soon enough. Okay, so we're so close to announcing the winners. We want to remind you that after we announce the winners, we'll have another panel discussion that's going to bring a mix of academic and industry perspectives on the new space environment and the critical skills needed to sustain those technologies. There's a ton to unpack on this topic, so please stay tuned for that.
Yeah, but for now, we have the highly anticipated interview with the founder of DEF CON, Jeff Moss, who may shed some light on what we can expect for the 30th anniversary of DEF CON next year. This will also be followed by an announcement of the winners of this year's competition. So with that, we're going to toss it over to Delia and Steve, who are on the line with Jeff.
And we'll open it up.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff. Good
Hey,
to see
everybody.
you. Looks like it's really cold wherever you are, but
It
we're
is.
so excited. We're so excited to have you join us today. It's nice to see you without all the masks on. The last time we saw you was at DEF CON. And so we've set up a few questions for you before we have you announce our winner later on in the show. But let's get right to it. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you'd like to see the space sector collaborate with DEF CON in the future?
Yeah, so I'm super excited by the work HackaSat is doing, because you're really pioneering a way of thinking about sort of CTF in space. And if you think about how DEF CON has grown, we provide this sort of stage and platform and quality filter and some initial inspiration in the audience, but we don't know how to run a satellite CTF, right? So we're dependent. We need to find really awesome partners like yourself. So now that we know that you can pull it off, that it's possible, we can start thinking bigger and larger. And if you think what's happening over the next 10 years, I would not be surprised if people try to put micro data centers in space to support other, orbital data processing. I mean, it's just, we're at the very beginning of this environment. And so you might think, well, I understand orbital, I understand uplinks. It's like, but it's going to change so much. And so DEF CON wants to be there, and we want to be part of this revolution. So if you have new ideas, we want to support you in all the players.
Well, yeah, I think that's awesome. Hackasat is we're so excited to lend a hand in that vision, and I also know the Aerospace Village is excited to continue bringing CTFs and workshops and hands-on activities to bring in those like novice and intermediate folks as well. So we're hoping that efforts like this broaden the reach and collaboration with industry as well.
Well, and it's scary how fast teams catch on. I bet people who are noobs on your last year's contest saw a huge improvement in their skills in just 1 year. You know, it's different, but it's not that different. And I bet they love a challenge. I'm really curious to see how all the teams did.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. So in our qualification event the first year, we had a lot of players. Our qualification event this year, we had less players, but more players scored points versus last year. So right to your point, we saw the quality go up, knowledge go up, and that's really what our goal was: cyber and space communities to bring together to care about global cybersecurity in our space systems.
Yeah, big sorting, right? They figure out who the teammates are that are into it, and I bet by year 3 you're going to have some pretty advanced teams in there.
Yeah, we're excited about it. So DEF CON's hitting its 30th anniversary in August next year. It's super exciting. Everyone's looking forward to it. The brand guide was released. It's all the throwback is amazing, especially if you grew up in that era. So can you tell us, do you have anything, big things in store? Who's doing the CTF? Are you allowed to let on?
No, we've picked the CTF organizer. We need to talk to them more before we tell them that we've selected them. Okay. And we figure for the first year, new organizer, 30th anniversary, it's not going to be a all on super order of the overflow finals. It's probably going to be more fun for the first year to help the organizers get their feet underneath it and come up with a couple new ideas. And then by 31, it'll be probably back to full power. So we're really focusing on community for 30. The theme is sort of homecoming. We just want to really celebrate that we've gotten through COVID. We've been together for so long, and just really sort of a community celebration. And so I think that'll be great.
Yeah, no, it sounds excellent. I'm glad you, obviously you're thinking through this stuff. So we're excited. But looking at the evolution, where you started to where you are now, do you see like anything, what do you think the next iteration in 10 years of DEF CON, what does it look like?
Well, so, I mean, when we started, we didn't really even start DEF CON Capture the Flag, but when it organically evolved and it was just people attacking our network, and we have to channel this energy somehow because they're just trashing the network. So it turned into a game, and that's how Capture the Flag began. And so now it's sort of like, well, there's not really that organic construction anymore because we've been doing it for so long. And so I'm always looking to see, well, where is there something that's sort of organically growing? And we saw that a bit with the biohacking village. I mean, the first year there was a biohacking, it was like one guy with energy drinks at a table. I'm not kidding. By the next year, it was a big group. And by the third year, it was completely out of control. And so I'm always on the lookout to see where we can plant seeds. And I think what's happening over the next 10 years is that, good or bad, policy is invading, right? The stuff we're doing has political implications. And because of that, it impacts business and governance. And because of that, governance is getting involved, right? Policymakers are starting to show up more. We're starting to try to get them involved because I figure if we don't have a seat at the table, it'll get done to us. We need to participate so we're part of the conversation. So I think over 10 years, we'll see more of that. We might see this continuation of some more remote kind of virtual participation, but fascinatingly, we don't get that much participation online. People want to see people face to face. We'll get some remote participation from people in other countries that can't travel to the States, but really they want to see each other. So I don't think that the in-person experience in the next 10 years is going away. If anything, it'll just grow or evolve to be a little bit more helping you find your community, right? Find your posse, your crew. And I think it'll be a little bit more international. And so when I talk to other people in other countries, they're constantly asking DEF CON, come do something in our country. Oh, we'll explore that. Kind of like what we did in China, but that's not happening anytime soon in China again. So maybe we'll find some other place to go or some other way to take DEF CON hackers in the community and bring it to some other place, like we did for the film festival, Tribeca Film Festival in New York. We did once. I'm excited. You know, every time our crew goes somewhere else, we just have a great time, and the energy and the ideas are flowing. So I'm really excited to see though what your community's done.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, that's kind of where you went, and I'll add two things here. So we, like US Space Force, US Air Force, there's typically this like stigma that, you know, DoD is maybe bad, whatever, but we really enjoy doing this. We enjoy bringing this and being such big stakeholders in the space industry. We have technology to bring to that community that's not necessarily accessible on eBay. You know, we even chatted about that before DEF CON. Like, can we even get our hands on some stuff and just bring it for the floor, for the village, for people to get their hands on? So we hope to continue to bring that value, and we also—
Well, the industry's not doing it. They didn't do it. It was up to you or another group, an outside group, to do it. So yeah, I applaud that, because otherwise it probably wouldn't get done. Boeing's probably not thinking about this, how to engage this community, but you are.
Yeah, so hopefully we see that shift a little in the future too. And then on your policy note, I had written down a question about that, because we're really interested in how we can take any lessons you've already learned. You know, Steve, you can talk a little bit about our experience in the voter hacking sandbox. We went to RSA's voter hacking sandbox right before DEF CON got canceled. Safe mode happened, DEF CON safe mode. So we didn't do it in person at the voter hacking village that year, but we learned so much about voting security. And obviously with the past election and all sorts of this in the trades recently, do you have any insights on how we can help influence policy? What are the right procedures or tactics? And maybe there is an example out there. I throw the voting village out because
I just think there's not a lot of nuance when it comes to people talking about space. It seems very black and white. There's a satellite, there's a rocket, and every time China or Russia does an ASAT test and takes out a satellite, you see a little bit more conversation around the policy around space debris and lack of sort of regulation or treaty in space. Maybe there needs to be a space treaty, but there's not a lot of nuance. Like, for example, when Russia builds a satellite and is planning to basically physically attack another satellite, like just mosey their satellite right up next to it and clamp on. The designers, have they even thought about a defense against that? Is that even in the conversation? And I think all these what would industrial espionage look like in space? And I'm starting to think this is like James Bond 1964 territory, when the rocket goes up and it swallows another satellite. Well, all your secrets are gone, right? Just because it's in space does not mean it's untouchable, you know, physically. And so I think, imagine not just the tamper evident village, but tamper evident village in space. You know, you have a lot of different disciplines overlapping that I'm just excited to see where it goes once people wake up to the fact that it's multidimensional.
Yeah.
All good points. And I think, just to go back to your initial comment about like the in-person, we were able to touch and feel the voting machines and really understand, yeah, you can hack a voting machine by the piece of paper you put in it. You don't have to like do any of the electronic things, and it's impactful. And that's why I think you're finding, and we all feel like we want to be in person and face to face, because the impact is much greater than the virtual world. Certainly we can be productive and maybe more efficient sometimes virtually, but the impact is a little less. And that's why we love what you're doing, and we want to keep participating. And we're looking forward to do it in any way possible, especially when it comes to cybersecurity in space.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I think we're ready to get started announcing the winners. So we're gonna keep you on the line.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Space Force and the Air Force and all of the organizers. You know, like, we're all just really excited to have you on the line, and all your support in building this community and having the aerospace village. So thank you from all of us for joining from that cold outdoor weather you're in. And
hey, this is the beautiful Northwest right here, the beautiful Northwest.
Oh, great. Great. Okay, cool. Well, we agree. It is beautiful, but it might be chilly.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll see you here shortly to announce the first place winner. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
DT.
Right on.
Okay, and are we on camera?
All right,
All right.
we are back, everybody. I know this is the moment that the teams are all really excited for. This is the worst part, having to wait this long. So without further ado, I'm back with Steve and Jason. Steve's going to go ahead and announce third place.
The difference between third and fourth place was a scant 200 points. Congratulations to Dice Gang. Back.
And to announce second place, Jason.
And the second place team with first blood on challenges 4 and 6, pulling can into space.
And to announce first place, DT, take it away.
Sorry, one sec, Jeff. 3, 2, 1, you're in.
Hey, thank you. Okay, so the winning team this year at HAS2 came so close last year to clinching it, but they failed in their on-orbit exercise. Otherwise, it would have been a cinch for them. Well, this year, they brought it. They crushed on-orbit challenge, and they also crushed all the competition. So, congratulations, HAS2 winner, Solar Wine.
All right, everybody. So that wraps it up. Don't forget, we still have a great panel immediately following this broadcast. I want to thank every one of our viewers. You know, space is an international thing, and we need everyone's help around the globe to make this happen. So thank you all for all your participation, your interest. Stay tuned, stick with it. And with that, we're out from Los Angeles. One big round of applause for the team, the organizers, and all our viewers and interested participants. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I am Steve Colenzo from the Air Force Research Lab's Information Directorate, one of the 4 individuals that are running the HACASAT event. And we have this lovely panel of individuals that we are looking forward to discussing a lot of different things regarding commercializing space and talent and skills that you may or may want to have as you look to making space a part of your life and or career. So thank you everyone for being here. We're at the dawn of a new era for space exploration, where at the moment, barrier of entry is at an all-time low, considering where we came from in the 50s. Relatively cheap and ready access to space allows ideas to become reality awfully quick. And it seems as though a commercial space race is accelerating, which can be seen in the billions of dollars that are being invested by both the public and private sectors around the globe annually. So in this panel, Realizing Space Commercialization, Who's Got the Chops? We're going to hear a variety of perspectives on the necessary entrepreneurial vision, technical aptitude, and risk tolerance required to navigate the potential investments being made for future space endeavors for companies, individuals, as well as larger other entities to take advantage of as we move forward in the next 100, 200 years. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to spend the next 45 minutes with you. I would like to start with Mr. Robert Powell, the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity at NASA, to give a couple opening remarks, who you are, where you came from, and what do you do?
Hey, Steve, thanks so much. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Department of the Air Force for their leadership role in bringing together what I think is an important event. A little bit about my background. I've been operating in some capacity for the last 25 years with cybersecurity. And I have the great fortune of today being in a senior advisory capacity with NASA. My position is within the Office of the Chief Information Officer. And in that role, I work closely with our mission programs, our center, CISOs, and our agency leadership team members on a myriad of mission cyber matters, typically in the areas of cyber policy execution, risk mitigation, and risk governance. To add a little bit more context for my role, as you can imagine, corporate cybersecurity is an area where large agencies, large companies have to have expertise. But within entities like NASA, we also have to have cyber expertise on the mission side of our house. And so our corporate side, we handle the traditional enterprise IT services that you can imagine. We have that cyber expertise there. But on the mission side, we also have to have certain cyber expertise that is slightly different from the corporate side of the house. And within NASA, it's heavily focused on our engineering processes, for instance, associated with the life cycle to build out a mission program or a mission asset. So my role was created in 2016. It is an agency leadership position, and this role was created to specifically bridge the gap, if you will, between the traditional CIO's office and our mission programs, as well as our agency engineering office. So excited to be here today. Again, very passionate about cybersecurity, and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Robin. Thank you for that. Much appreciated. It's certainly important, the cybersecurity, the cyber hygiene of our space systems. And it sounds like you and your role are certainly thinking of that. So thank you for being here. Next, we have Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Showalter, the Director of Space Systems Research Center. Over to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Dan Showalter, and as Steve said, I'm an Air Force officer. Spent almost exclusively my entire career working in the space community, whether on the research and development side or academia, and then even on the operational side at a combatant command. And in my current role, as Steve said, I'm the director of the Space Systems Research Center, which falls in the Department of Astronautics at the United States Air Force Academy. And my role is really to implement our department's motto of learning space by doing space. And what that means to us is that we actually provide cadets the opportunity to design, build, integrate, test, and operate real-world satellites. And we currently have 2 on orbit right now, working on a 3rd. So the cadets get the opportunity to work on the engineering side of the house in the development of those systems, as well as the operation and analysis once those systems are on orbit, and how do we provide data to our AFRL sponsors. And that's all I have. Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate the intro. Next, we have the CEO of Atomionix, Mr. Sahil Tapiawala. So please, sir, let's hear your background and what you're doing with this company.
Thanks, Steve. To briefly share about my background, I absolutely enjoy working at the intersection of technology and science, and later finance as well, to be honest. And this has taken me to interesting roles and projects. I have worked on biomimetic robotic stingrays as a material scientist, as well as a control systems engineer. Furthermore, it has also brought me to helping deep tech companies in Singapore fundraise and hire the right team, and beyond that, understand the world of venture capital through a stint in deep tech VC and accelerators in Singapore. Currently, I dedicate my waking hours to building quantum sensors to measure gravity at Atomionix. Atomionix is a VC-backed startup, and we use gravity to create an X-ray of the Earth's crust. Now, this has some incredible uses as well. One can exactly pinpoint oil and gas reserves and mineral reserves to democratize access to energy. Beyond that, it can also be used to identify underground infrastructure, bunkers, tunnels, etc. We extend the same technology to navigation systems as well that work in completely GPS-denied environments. But what really excites us at Atomionix is the fact that we can build a completely new GPS or global positioning system. Our sensors can measure gravity so precisely and in such a way that we can create a unique fingerprint of any place. And using that fingerprint, we can position ourselves anywhere in the world, be it underwater, underground, and even in space. And that's essentially what excites us. And I'm quite glad to understand more about HAS2 as well, which operates at the intersection of, again, physics, cybersecurity, and computing platforms. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Steve.
Sahil, thank you so much. It's interesting to talk about GPS, and hopefully we can revisit that later, because the unique thing about it is it's not just latitude, longitude, altitude, but there's that 4th dimension of time, which is really important as we use it and leverage it in devices and applications. So hopefully we can visit that. Thank you so much for being here. Next, we have Mr. Gabe Mounts, the Deputy Director of SpaceWorks. Thank you for joining us, Gabe. Over to you.
Hey, thanks, Steve. I am with the Air Force Research Lab Space Vehicles, technically, and recently became a Space Force civil servant, where for a while I've been doing a lot of space research, but probably the last 4 years or so, I've been doing work in accelerating solutions from the non-traditional industry sector, otherwise known as the startup sector, towards the mission sets that we have in the Space Force. That whole activity, what we call the Space Force Accelerator Program, is now being integrated into SpaceWorks that we just stood up a couple of months ago. And for that reason, I'm now the Deputy Director of SpaceWorks. For SpaceWorks, we will operate the space funding line for all SIBRs and SITRs going forward. We are the space arm of AFWorks, and we will continue to run a number of programs underneath SpaceWorks, including the accelerators. One of the other major programs that I recently became in charge of, I co-lead the first space prime effort under SpaceWorks that we're calling Orbital Prime. And we're intending to prime the pump on the nascent commercial market of on-orbit servicing, assembling, manufacturing toward a demonstration in 2024 of active debris remediation. So we're really trying to push the envelope of where the market's going in space, and I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you. We're happy to have you. It's really cool, though, that the government is starting to look at these small businesses, as we call them, non-traditionals, because they might be startups, and it might be a little difficult to understand how to work with the government, especially when it comes to the space domain. because as far as however many years ago, let's say 10, it's not regular that you see all these startups in the space world like you did in the internet, and then application companies, whether it's platforms as a service, software as a service. So there's unique opportunities out there to do what these companies really want to do for both the public and private, and what we call it and we refer to that as dual use technology, which is really good. It's good for the globe, and it's good for, I think, for the space world as well. So thank you for being here, Gabe. And lastly, we have Mr. Eric Truitt, Chief Solutions Officer at Terran Orbital. Thanks for being on this, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, HAS2, and the Air Force, for the opportunity to be here today. I am recovering from laryngitis, so if my voice squeaks like a teenage boy, you'll know why. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer of Terran Orbital. If you haven't heard of us, Terran's a U.S.-based, U.S.-owned and controlled manufacturer, owner, and operator of satellite systems and other space-based solutions. We provide Earth observation data and analytics to defense, intelligence, civil, and commercial end users. Terran's built on the success of two subsidiary companies, Tyvek Nanosatellite Systems and Predasar, and we basically went from a garage-based business about a decade ago to recently announcing our intention to become a public company early in 2022. My background to get to become a Chief Solutions Officer is I've spent the past 21 years mostly on the collection and analysis side of the intelligence business. I started off in the U.S. Navy, where I spent 5 years as a cryptologist before entering the private contractor world. Early in my career, my specialties were in satellite communications, cybersecurity, and RF signals intelligence. However, my career evolved into more of developing operational prototypes, both the hardware and software systems and applications to solve the top collection and analysis challenges for the intelligence community and the Department of Defense during the campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan, and across the globe. Notably, I ended up at Georgia Tech Research Institute, not as a pure academic, but in a position where I had the privilege to lead the innovation and strategy for solution development for both intelligence and space community sponsors. The diversity experience that I've been fortunate enough to have over my career in both the missions and the technologies that I've worked with has given me this ability to work problems backwards, to really identify the right technology, the right expertise, and the right business approach to developing the right solution, often in, very early in program efforts. So it's a we've heard the fail fast side of, startup culture, but really, you can do that when you have a great depth of expertise and a great set of, connections to the right people who have this vast experience. So it's very important to leverage not just your own experience, but that of the team around you and your colleagues throughout the industry. And this space community is a very tight industry, and we enjoy a lot of the benefit of being able to work together on these problems. One primary solution I talk about that I've developed during my career was a radar technology that we've ended up using here at Terran Orbital as a part of our new Predasar constellation. It's a 96 satellite constellation that delivers synthetic aperture radar imagery and other types of Earth observation solutions with a very high revisit rate around the Earth. But we'll talk more about what Terran is and what our what solutions means to us later. But I have a relentless passion for problem solving, especially in the space domain, and I'm glad to be here to share some of that passion with everyone here today. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for that intro. And you hit on two things that are near and dear to the heart of HAS2. And that is, when you say looking at things in reverse, it's really backing up that timeline when we start to focus on cybersecurity versus bolting it on in the end, because oftentimes that can go sideways on us, especially as I say us as a globe, as we're utilizing these space systems, not just for a government or what nation state, whatever their purpose originally was, much like GPS and whatnot. So that's the first thing that we're really trying to do at HAS2 and drive home. But another thing is, with the democratization of space, you can start in a garage and become a much larger company, and ultimately, as you said, plans to go public. That's really important for what we're really trying to cultivate here, but we really want to make sure that cybersecurity is upfront with all these solutions, whether they're hardware or software. So thank you so much for that intro. Now I'd like to get into a little more specific technical questions. I mean, not technical in terms of the science quite yet, but just dig a little bit deeper into each individual that's on the panel and sort of how they can shed some light on what we talked about of the goals, especially those two things that are near and dear to HAS2's heart. So, Mr. Powell, as we look as you in your day-to-day efforts, come across more companies that are either forming or that have been formed, and maybe they're spinning off different business models or different business units that are looking at space. Are you focusing on their attention to cybersecurity? Is that sort of a requirement? How do you actually bound that to determine, okay, this company cares about cybersecurity and they're a startup or they're a medium-sized company, and that's really important? And I'm not saying they'll have a competitive advantage, but just that how do you make sure that that's a focus of what their product or service is? Over to you.
Sure, great question, Steve. I would probably break that apart into a couple of areas. The first area being companies that are doing business with the government. So I can speak on behalf of NASA in particular. Within NASA, we have requirements and procurement regulations that actually define the cyber controls, the cyber requirements that entities doing business with us are expected to perform. Right. So if we are executing a contract with a commercial entity to build a space asset, we have defined in the contract cyber requirements that must be met. The underpinnings of those cyber requirements come from NIST, right? The NIST 853 series is familiar to anybody working within the cyber domain, and the NIST 853 series is certainly applicable to the space segment. So that's one kind of category that I would consider. The other category are entities that are not necessarily doing business with the government, but they are launching assets into the greater space domain, the space ecosystem at large. And in that sense, there is still a need to ensure that those assets being launched into space are being developed and operated from a risk management perspective. And again, I'll introduce NIST, right? So the NIST series of controls is not exclusively intended for the government. It is publicly accessible, and those controls can be used by private entities as well. I'd like to add a little bit more context on the commercial side of the house. In October, DHS and Department of Commerce hosted a space cyber symposium, and Don Graves opened up the symposium with a couple of comments that I think, again, really helps set the stage. So I'm just going to quote a couple of these data points quickly. One is investment in space commerce is surging, with $5.7 billion in private equity invested in just the first quarter of 2021. The other data point that he mentioned is the number of commercial satellites placed in space is growing rapidly, from 140 satellites launched in 2012 to 1,283 launched in 2020. So again, I talked earlier about the ecosystem, right? As we are introducing new assets into the space ecosystem, management of risk is a priority, right? Not only to the individual asset itself, but also to the greater ecosystem. I would close this out by pointing the audience to a number of resources that are, again, publicly available that touch on the topic of risk management in the space domain. Space Policy Directive 5 in particular is an area of focus that I would encourage anybody to look at that has an interest in this area. Supply chain risk management is specifically highlighted in SPD 5. I think that's an area of growing concern, right? Where do we source our parts from? Not only our flight hardware, but also our flight software. Do we have confidence in the credibility of those components? And I would also mention two other, I'd say, coordination activities in the space cyber domain. One is the Space ISAC. And the Space ISAC works very closely with both DHS and CISA, as well as the commercial entities, to ensure there's awareness of best practices, as well as standards, right? So trying to have consistency in the standards that are being deployed across the space domain. And the last entity that I would mention is the Satellite Institute Association. They represent a number of commercial entities and ensuring, again, that there is broad coordination with the government to address concerns that are relevant to the commercial space.
Okay, gotcha. That was a lot. Really excellent to put that all into context. But what I think I'm hearing is the risk tolerance of putting hardware and software into space is a lot lower than, let's say, the analogy of the internet in its beginning days, where you could throw up a web page and it might have a lot of holes in it, and it was really never a hygiene aspect to it. But now, as we know how serious things are and how fast these objects move up in outer space, tolerance for I don't want to say mistakes, but making sure the hygiene is good is really it's important. So I would say there's low tolerance for those types of things, and that's what you're focusing on.
That's exactly correct. And I may have misspoke earlier. It's the Satellite Industry Association as the other key coordination piece, right? So yeah, you're exactly right. I guess I would close it in saying that the threat landscape is evolving, right? 20 years ago, we didn't necessarily have to deal with the element of cyber threats that we do to the space industry today. So much as the cyber risk landscape is evolving, we have to evolve our practices as well to ensure that we can operate safe and effectively in space.
Gotcha. Loud and clear. Thank you for that. Which is a really cool segue, because cyber is one thing, space is another. They're definitely connected 100%. You really have to understand both from all the reasons you just mentioned and the guidance that's out there. But as we look to the education of, and typically how you would get into the space world if you wanted to pursue an education in it, what do the curriculums look like and whatnot? And that brings us to Lieutenant Colonel Showalter. So, sir, as you look at, or as you teach and understand what it takes to operate, understand, actually do anything in outer space, you said the motto was learning space by doing space. So currently, if you take a snapshot of the, let's say, astronautics department that you run, has the educational or the curriculum aspect of learning by doing, has it changed much from when it started? Let's say, I don't know exactly when it started or when it formed at the Academy, but when it started to where it is now. And do you see that evolving as cybersecurity becomes more of an inherent thing that needs to be looked at no matter what you're doing?
Well, what I would say, Steve, is that the fundamentals to space, the space domain, engineering in space, whatever that is, those aren't changing. I mean, the physics doesn't change. So what we look at and what we teach is going to be very similar to what was seen in the past. What is changing now are really the applications. So what you can do in space, and that's driven by cost. It's become much cheaper. It's driven by different phenomenology that it becomes affordable now to detect from space. So I would argue that the fundamentals aren't changing, but what we need to do a better job of communicating to young people is the opportunities to get involved in space, regardless of your discipline. They're available. And what I think about a lot now is decision making. So we have long collected data from space and used that to inform decisions. What we as a community are trying to do now, whether it's in business or government, is make decisions faster. So you can incorporate things like data analytics, and those types of folks, they haven't always been, I don't want to say, they haven't been necessarily aware that they have an opportunity to participate in the space community. And I would say the same thing from a cyber perspective, whether it's machine learning, AI, all of those things can be applied in a space context or a space application. And that's really what I think we need to do a better job of from an education standpoint, is communicating those opportunities that are available. I mean, we're always going to need electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, physicists, the whole thing. And their fundamentals, they're not changing much. I mean, yeah, the things are improving. What we know about teaching is improving. Even what we know about phenomenology is improving, but the fundamentals aren't changing. So all that to say, I think we just need to do a good job of incorporating all these other disciplines into the space community.
Okay, cool. And that's kind of what I was getting at. So do you see that evolution actually happening with textbooks and the hands-on learning where you are incorporating opportunities to use data analytics, data mining, let's say artificial intelligence, machine learning, and or quantum information sciences into in space and how they relate? Because I think if you zoom out, if you're really, really focused on the space world, which is hard, right? I think you might admit that those physics, yes, they're physics and they're science-based, but they're different up in outer space than they are here terrestrially. And calculating all that stuff isn't as straightforward as some of the equations that we did learn if we only took, physics maybe a couple different times in college. So do you see the curriculum evolving where you are, not you, but the community is including these other disciplines so that you're learning them side by side, but not necessarily becoming an expert in them?
I think that's a tough question in the sense that I look at the people that I've worked with in my career, and you have people that are really, really smart in orbital mechanics that couldn't put two pieces of hardware together. I mean, they would end up in smoke if they tried. So what I love about the space business is it's really the integration and synthesis of all these different disciplines that can be tied together. And I think it's difficult for one person to be able to take all of that knowledge and incorporate it into a single brain. But what's great is you can incorporate a team where you have expertise in these sub-disciplines. So I don't necessarily think that it's necessary to integrate cyber education with space education necessarily, but it's really making the folks that are working on the space side aware of the importance of cyber, and the folks that are working on the cyber side aware of how they can contribute in the space domain.
Perfect. That totally makes sense. And I completely understand. You can't be the one person that knows everything, but at least if you're aware and you understand how the different disciplines impact space, then you can, if you're a company or if you're part of a team in a company, you can assemble the right team. And I think, perfect. And I appreciate that insight, which I think really marries well to Mr. Tapiawala's company, as well as just understanding that I believe you have some multidisciplinary teams and what you're trying to do. So if you could, I'll ask you a couple different questions, but the first one sort of piggybacking on the Colonel's comments. How important is the team you've made up, or whatever you plan to do in the future, how important is it to have those different disciplines and have each of those disciplines not necessarily worried about one another from an expertise level, but just that be aware so that they can contribute in this sort of give and take as you sort of develop products?
Absolutely. In fact, I was planning to chime in on that as well, because Lieutenant Colonel Dan really mentioned or hit the point on its head that you don't really need to know everything about a particular topic, but you need to know how other topics also operate in the context of the project that we are trying to implement. So for example, when we work on making quantum sensors at Atom Ionics, we have quantum physicists working extremely closely with electronics engineers, as well as mechanical engineers and software engineers to build a product. So this is not just a physics experiment, or it's not just an electronics product or a chip that we are building, but it's a combination of it all. And I think what has really tied our team together is the appreciation for where the other things fit into the puzzle that building a quantum sensor is about. And I think that's a question that we always get asked, as well as at the intern level as well, that even our interns end up contributing massively to quantum sensors, and they come from a background in, say, engineering or physics, but they know a specific topic in, say, mechanical engineering or electronics engineering. But you can carve out that part in a quantum sensor, and they can contribute that, and then also understand how that fits into the whole setup. So I guess it's important to just understand the context in an interdisciplinary team, and I think that's where team composition becomes quite critical, and just an appreciation for other domains as well.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I can certainly see where that makes sense, and that's a perfect piggyback on on what the Colonel said about the different disciplinaries and understanding and sort of that education of not having to know all of it. But now, can you speak a little bit about what does that mean when you're looking at the business side of things with venture capitalism? Because I'm assuming, and I could be totally wrong, and please tell me if I am, that probably is very, very different from orbital mechanics or quantum sciences. But speaking to a venture capitalist, understanding what they care about, and ultimately getting funding from them so you could actually have that capital to start a business, hire individuals and whatnot. I'm assuming you have to have some chops in that world as well.
I guess that's also one of the ways to identify who the right partners would be at the financing level. So, for example, in our case at Atma-Inix, we are quite fortunate to have investors who are aligned with the technologies that we are building, but more so importantly, they are aligned with the way that the markets are developing. And I think just as is the case with different engineering domains as well as with different domains in physics, there's also an aspect of business development and finance that one needs to understand. It is just another domain that comes into the picture in a startup. And so one of the key things that I guess we had to really improve our mental model on was how do the markets fit into utilizing quantum sensing or the technologies that we are building. And especially in conversations with, say, financiers, investors, or whoever that doesn't come from an engineering background, I think it's to start off with the topic that interests them the most, which is how big the market can be, how fast growing is the market. In addition to that, what are the use cases that this completely new technology enables? And I think that's what's attractive to a lot of investors as well, who are entering this domain in droves, to be honest. So in fact, there's also quite evident through the amount of deep tech venture capital investors that have come into the picture, who not just look at this from a perspective of what is your revenue growth rate, but what are the completely new markets and technologies what are the new markets that new technologies can enable, and which is a completely new way to look at venture capital financing.
Okay, got it, totally. And I think that weaves a really good thread through the fact that when you look at the title of this panel, commercializing, space commercialization, realizing it, and who has the chops. It's really anyone. So if you look at outer space, encompasses the globe, right? It surrounds the Earth, and that transcends to the technology and the capabilities that are up there, because you really can come from any different discipline, put your expertise to work, and be in the space world if you so choose. So really good, all great points, which I think also piggybacks nicely to introducing Mr. Gabe Mounts when it comes to the space works, as you mentioned, working with the government, if it makes sense, but opportunities for small businesses who don't have a ton of capital and are a full staff of, let's say, multiple mechanical engineers, orbital physicists, and whatnot. But do you see any trends of where a lot of these companies that are forming are focusing on, whether it's quantum, AI, ML, all the buzzwords you would expect, sort of what the kind of Colonel's hinted on, where all these other disciplines, you need to be aware of them. But do you see a lot of companies marrying those together, or are they just purely space-based and they might get interested in the other disciplines if you mention it, or some of the feedback they get on their proposals or whatnot?
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do is really looking at markets, right? It's understanding where the markets are going, especially when it comes to space, because that's where I'm busy tech scouting to understand what capabilities are being created